Welcome, everyone. We're just going to wait a moment as as various people join the webinar, and then we'll get started. Thanks for being here. Thank you all again for being here. There's still people flowing into the webinar, but we'll be getting started with some brief introductions. Hello, my name is Joy Moses. I'm the Vice President of Research and Evidence with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I would like to welcome you to this webinar today. It's entitled Where the Road Ends, Permanent Supportive Housing Outcomes and Moving On. This session marks the first in a series of webinars we'll do focused on our Research into Action series, which was which is a project in which we funded 10 different research teams to investigate topics that would be particularly informative to policy and practice efforts. I'm going to, at this point, welcome my colleague, Nicole Dubois, to say a little bit more about the Research into Action series. We collaborated together with the researchers to help build the bridges between research and the work that I'm sure all of you on this call do within the field. Nicole?
Thanks, Joy. And it's great to be with you all today. So, as Joy mentioned, the Research into Action series is all about connecting evidence to real world impact to improve service delivery and shape smart public policy. So, the first group of research projects, including the two you'll hear about today, study ways to improve the effectiveness of permanent supportive housing, or PSH. PSH is the leading solution to homelessness for people who have been unhoused for a long time, who have a documented disability, and who would benefit from ongoing support. We know from decades of evidence at this point that PSH works. Most people who can access a PSH program gain and maintain stable housing. These research projects add to that proof while also pointing out ways that PSH can better serve tenants, that we can ensure fair access to resources and continue to build capacity to better match the need in our communities. The other group of research projects study responses to unsheltered homelessness, highlighting how street outreach, encampment response, and bridge housing can bring life-saving resources and services to people and ultimately help make connections to permanent and stable housing. So over the next few months, we'll be sharing the researchers' reports and uplifting key takeaways through webinars like this one and summary documents and other materials. Our next webinar, which will cover how PSH is established, operated, and sustained in rural continuums of care, will take place in mid-March. So please make sure that you're subscribed to the Alliance's newsletter to learn the latest updates, and we'll also drop a link in the chat to a webpage that hosts the materials for all these projects, and we'll continue to update that as new research is released. So as Joyce said, we've had the pleasure of checking in with these teams as they conducted their research, and we're so excited that they can now share their important work with you. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Jared and Gary.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And just on behalf of our research team, which includes, Jared and Stephen Smith, I just wanted to thank the Alliance for all their support, not just in terms of funding the research, but in terms of giving us an opportunity to interact with folks both at the National Alliance meetings and in a variety of different kinds of webinars. Um, this research was really motivated by a few salient facts that hadn't been kind of completely studied in the ways that we're trying to do here. First fact, the average person who's experiencing homelessness is older now than 10 years ago. Another salient fact, we know that both Black people and Indigenous populations are overrepresented among the homeless population. Another salient fact, housing costs are going up. And there's been a lot of research, on these different verticals in terms of what might be driving increased homelessness among the aging, or what might explain the fact that we see overrepresentation among Black people experiencing homelessness, etc. But what we were really trying to highlight here was whether PSH is more or less effective among the aging population, and to recognize that, at age 65, there's a big shift in the amount of entitlement support that are available to broad sets of populations. And so this really motivated this study. We focus on Los Angeles County, which is epicenter of the homelessness crisis here in the United States. And we use a mixed methods designed to examine both how risk and PSH effectiveness varies by age and race ethnicity. And with that, we'll turn it over to the lead researcher on our team, Jared Schachner.
I
Thanks.
just want to add a brief note before Jared
Please.
starts. We will be taking questions towards the end of the session. If you have a question at any point during the session, please do type it into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen so that the speakers and the moderator can see your questions, because we do want to answer those. And with that, I'll stop interrupting. Go ahead.
Thank,
Thank you.
thanks so much, Joy, and thanks, Gary. Thanks to all of you for joining us. So I'll be taking us through a brief overview of the research that we did for this project supported by NAEH. There's a lot more detail in the gerontologist special issue that our study was published in. But for now, let's talk through the three key research questions that oriented our work. The first was assessing how the risk of returning to LA County Continuum of Care services after receiving a prior service varied across the age and race dimensions, as Gary alluded to. So we're interested to see if there is variation in risk between older adults. So we look at age 55 plus, as well as that specific 65 plus category, and compare risk to younger adults. We also look among the older adult population whether there's racial differences in risk, and whether that corresponds to the longstanding research finding that Black older adults are at particularly high risk. We also consider other race ethnicities, including the AIN population and the Hispanic population, but for this study, we primarily focused on that Black-white comparison, for a variety of reasons that speak to prior research. When we compared outcomes and risk to emergency shelter, we wanted to understand whether Housing First programs, specifically PSH, are particularly effective for Black versus white older adults in reducing this risk of returning to homelessness. So in our reading of the literature, there's been less theory or clarity around why there might be racial differences in PSH effectiveness, as well as within the older adult population in particular, why we would see racial differences in this intervention's effectiveness. And then if we do see racial variation in the probability of returning to homelessness after PSH, we want to understand why there might be differences along racial lines when it comes to PSH's effects in reducing this risk. The data and methods we used combined both quantitative and qualitative research. So from a quantitative perspective, we used the LA County Homelessness Management Information System data that's based at CPL's Research Accelerator. For our main analysis, we focused on the pre-COVID period, 2013 to 2019. In supplementary analyses, we expanded to 2023. Of course, this COVID period created challenges for data collection and reliability, and so that's why we focused in that pre-COVID period for our main results. Our outcomes or our interests are looking at the probability a given individual who received a COC service during this time frame returned at any point during the time frame for additional COC service. And we thought this would be a good proxy for risk, indicating that some folks that didn't have their situations resolved and had to come back for additional services were at increased risk after an intervention compared to those who did not come back for additional services. Of course, there's some strong assumptions there that we tried to probe more deeply by looking at just returns to emergency shelter or street outreach as our main outcome. Again, trying to see whether there were differences in the risk of that undesirable outcome after receiving service. And then we supplemented with additional outcomes looking at age and race-based variation and the probability of exiting to renting or owning on their own or living with family and friends. And across the board, we expected PSH to drive more favorable outcomes overall. And we were less clear on whether there would be racial variation or age-based variation. We supplemented the quantitative work with qualitative interviews. So we had 40 interviews with racially diverse older adults, age 55 plus in LA County who were residing in PSH. And we encompassed both scatter site and project-based programs in our sample there. So this is one of the key findings, and this just focuses on risk and how it varies by age and race. So we stratified our sample based on age at 2013. We looked at younger adults, so individuals who were 25 through 44. Then we looked at middle-aged adults, 45 through 54, then 55 to 64 for older adults, and then retirement age 65 plus. And what I want to focus you on is these racial differences within each age bracket. So once you look overall at the risk gradient of the probability of returning to COC services, for middle-aged and older adults, you see that being kind of the period with the highest risk of that outcome. But then when you look at the racial differences, I think some important patterns emerge. I think the first pattern that emerges is that across all age brackets, you see that Black individuals, Black adults, are at higher risk of this undesirable outcome of returning to services. So that reinforces prior work about the relative risk among Black adults. But I think what we're contributing here is showing that that Black-white risk gap grows across the age distribution. And so you see what starts among younger adults as a 5 percentage point gap here, where Black younger adults exhibit a higher risk than white folks of similar age. You see that grow and almost double to 9 percentage points once you're at the retirement age group, right? So this is the intersectional dynamic or interactional dynamic where age and race combine to create elevated risk among Black older adults. When we look at PSH and emergency shelter, and we look at the associations between those interventions and this outcome of risk, and we look at white folks and Black folks across the same age breakdown, I think some additional important patterns emerge. The first is across the board, across all age and race combinations, you see really large risk reductions associated with receiving the PSH intervention. Okay, so that's a consistent finding across the board. But I think it's also important to show that for most of these age groups, the absolute drop in risk of returning to COC services is larger for Black folks than for white folks. And even more striking is the fact that if you look at this retirement age group on the far right, you see a vastly larger risk reduction effect among Black older adults or retirement age adults compared to white retirement age adults, right? So you see that PSH is really promoting a racially equitable outcome and is in some ways, by some measures, much more effective in reducing risk for Black older adults than white older adults. So when we shift to a different outcome, if we look at the probability of exiting to renting or owning, or living with family or friends, these are considered more desirable outcomes. We see a similar pattern where even when we shift the outcome, we see that across all four age brackets, Black adults who receive PSH are more likely to exit to this favorable destination based on the HMIS data than are white adults who receive PSH. So this is just another data point that suggests that Black folks are receiving larger risk reduction effects or more housing security benefits than are white folks in our sample. Again, we see this age-race interaction where the Black-white gap in this favorable outcome is largest among the older adult brackets, particularly for retirement age adults. And that just reinforces the patterns that I showed you before when we looked at the alternative returning to COC services outcome. So the key question here, the million-dollar question, is why do Black older adults exhibit more favorable PSH outcomes when compared to emergency shelter alternatives compared to white older adults? What are the mechanisms? What are the explanations here? So you might think that Black older adults could potentially have a lower disability, a lower acuity level when it comes to individual level factors like disability. We found that that was not the explanation in our exploratory analyses. What we found was a potentially surprising pattern that may partially explain what's going on here. So we found initial evidence that Black older adults, particularly retirement age older adults, are sorting into higher quality scattered site permit supportive housing programs on average than otherwise similar white older adults. So there's a program quality story among scattered site PSH that may explain this pattern. And during Q&A, we can talk more about how we measure quality, how we think about it. Since I only have a few more minutes, I want to take us to through the findings, and then we can come back there if we have time. I also want to come back to the qualitative interviews because this was an important data point that helped us understand why we would see racial differences in the effectiveness of this PSH intervention. And we found some compelling initial evidence that white older adults were very focused on only accessing PSH scatter site programs that were in neighborhoods they considered desirable. So what may have happened is their heavy priority on desirable neighborhoods, which often meant white and more affluent neighborhoods, may have meant that they were waiting for neighborhood characteristics that they found desirable rather than accessing the highest quality programs that they were able to get through the coordinated entry system as soon as possible. Right. So they may have been making a trade-off that wasn't clear to them, that they were getting higher quality neighborhoods from their perspective without focusing on the quality of the program itself. And we found that Black older adults did not seem to prize neighborhood quality in this way to the same extent, and they may have ended up, the Black older adults, in higher quality programs, even if they weren't in the more desirable neighborhoods, so to speak. So the main takeaway here is PSH is highly effective, as we already know from prior research, but crucially, we show that it's an equity promoting intervention. And we show this for older adults, especially Black older adults. And we also have supplementary analyses that show that for AIN older adults, this pattern may also be true in LA County. So I think it's important to think about the implications for policy and practice as well as research. From a policy perspective, I think the obvious takeaway is the rapidly and substantially expanding PSH slots is crucial. I think monitoring PSH effectiveness is also important because not all PSH is created equal. So how do we think about how the system as a whole and particular programs are in terms of effectiveness? And crucially, think about effectiveness in a more fine-grained manner. So can we isolate the effectiveness for different age race groups so we understand whether there's variation in effectiveness for various reasons across the age and race distributions? And this all requires developing very rigorous strategies for measuring, raising, and equalizing program quality. And I think this is really where Gary and I and Stephen feel additional research is needed. And just to start putting a finer point on that, we think program quality is often a black box right now, that there's not a very clear understanding of all the components of PSH program quality that may matter and what the estimated effect is of each of those characteristics of PSH programs. We also think we have to learn more about coordinated entry, so I'll talk about each of those points in turn. Starting with program quality, we think it's crucial to identify what are the key quality proxies, what are the key measurable factors that vary across PSH programs when it comes to resources, services, and staff. Can we figure out what those proxies are, measure them in a systematic way, and then assess the impact of each of those inputs into PSH effectiveness. And crucially, we want to know whether those factors may vary in their impact on reducing risk by age and race, because there's a possibility some factors matter more than others based on what your race ethnicity is and what age bracket you're in. For coordinated entry, I think we need to learn a lot more about that black box. So why would it be possible, as we learned through our interviews, that white older adults maybe had more say or more kind of leverage over their placement when it came to seeking desirable neighborhoods, right? What was going on in the coordinated entry process that allowed that and allowed racially disparate sorting patterns to emerge? I think an additional project could go really deep into that process to see how that unfolds. Um, since I'm running out of time, I don't want to spend too much time on these additional points on future research. So I'll just briefly say I think we need a broader set of outcomes, especially in the HMIS data ecosystem. I think thinking about differences in mortality risk, especially when we think about older adults, is a crucial next step. I think thinking beyond the black-white binary to probe more deeply differences between white older adults, black older adults, as well as AIN, Hispanic and multiracial background older adults is important, and that we should look into different subgroups, including those with different gender identities and sexual orientations. And then, as a neighborhood effects scholar myself, I think we have not thought enough about how much neighborhoods may matter in shaping PSH outcomes, right? So we think about PSH quality. It's not only what's happening in the building, what's happening outside the building may be important as well. So I'll stop there. Just the final point is that we need to think about multi-COC studies and not just focus on LA County or any one place, but see whether patterns replicate beyond that. Thank you all so much, and look forward to taking questions and discussing all this in more detail.
Thank you, Jared. And now we'll turn to Emmy, who's going to talk about her project that was focused on moving on efforts. Emmy?
Thanks, Joy. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. And again, thank you to the Alliance for having me and for supporting this work. So I'm going to present findings from two research projects that we recently completed, both which were generously funded by the Alliance and through the Hilton Foundation. And the first study examines permanent supportive housing exit outcomes. The second study looks at how PSH programs are assessing readiness to move on from PSH to housing without the supportive services. So what do we already know about PSH exits? I am a former social worker. I was a clinical supervisor in one of the oldest congregate PSH programs in the country. And I would hear, not infrequently from tenants, this is not my forever home. I would love to get out of here, live on my own eventually without, a case manager coming to my door all the time and, being all up in my business. So I started doing qualitative work on this. I was really interested in what was going on here. And, there were some program evaluations on outcomes of moving on initiatives. So these initiatives where people are being assisted with the transition from PSH. And findings from those evaluations and this qualitative work were consistent with what I was hearing from folks kind of anecdotally, that not every person in PSH wants or even needs to be in services indefinitely for a whole lifetime. These evaluations of moving on initiatives have shown fairly positive outcomes, but these have all been small studies with non-representative samples. Some are just a handful of people, some are a couple hundred, but it's still a very small study and they're about no more than 2 years follow-up period. So we needed larger studies with a lot more people looking out over a longer follow-up period to definitively say how people are moving on, whether they can successfully leave these services without serious consequences over time. Because the last thing we want is for people to end up back, on the wait list for these services. So there's this urgent policy imperative to answer this question of whether people do okay after PSH, in addition to the scientific motivations to do this work, and that is these potential HUD-imposed cuts to permanent supportive housing that may be coming down the pike. So it's very important right now to really get a better understanding of whether people successfully move on from these services. What sets them up for success? What can we do as a field to support people in this transition? So the Alliance and the Hilton Foundation were, like I said, generous enough to provide us with some funding to dig deeper into these questions at a population level in a 2-year study that investigated predictors of successful exits from PSH. In the study, we wanted to answer 2 overarching research questions. So what are the factors associated with successful and unsuccessful exits? And I will go more into those terms in a second. How does the likelihood of adverse events after PSH exit vary by exit type? We use a novel data linkage of HMIS or HIMIS, depending upon what area of the country you're from. and Medicaid claims data from a parent study PI'd by my colleague Joel Cantor at Rutgers. This data set included matched data from 19 of 21 counties in New Jersey and 45 of 67 counties in Pennsylvania. So very large amount of data. Because we were using these matched data, all participants were PSH enrollees with available Medicaid claims, and we were looking at the years 2016 to 2021. Before I go into the details on the studies, I just want to acknowledge our research team at Rutgers and University of Pitt, our community partner Monarch Housing, our study advisory board, which included individuals with lived and professional experience on PSH and PSH exits, and the tenant advocates who participated in the focus groups that we did in the second phase of the study. I also want to thank our funders and acknowledge Medicaid and HMIS state partners for providing access to these data. And this is your official disclaimer. All of this is our views and not necessarily theirs. So in this study, we used cross-sectional analysis of the Medicaid enrollees' last PSH program stay. We're looking at the two different exit types. The person's use of homeless services within 24 months of their last PSH exit, as well as a cohort analysis of enrollees' inpatient hospitalizations over time, both all-cause hospitalizations and any inpatient hospitalizations for mental illness in the year. And we adjusted for individual and program characteristics, year, and geographic unit fixed effects. This is for the quant nerds out there. So what did we find? And this is the citation for the report, which is now available on the Alliance website. The first major finding from the study is that while the majority of people in PSH did not exit the program during the study period, a sizable number did exit. So about 60% of those in PSH, as you can see in that light blue bar, in both states did not exit PSH during that study period, but roughly 12%, 11, 13, 14% there you can see, exited to a lower level of care or what we considered successful destinations. And I'll talk about that in a second, but that dark blue bar, and you can see it's kind of a similar breakdown between states. So what do I mean by successful destinations? So we defined this as permanent housing without paired support services, with or without a rental subsidy, indicating a lower level of care or need. Working with the data that we had, which was the HMIS data, we had to categorize destinations into those that could be considered more of a graduation from PSH to a lower level of care, and destinations that could be considered indicative of a higher level of care or needs, such as institutional settings, other homeless services, or non-permanent housing. And I want to say here that we recognize that this terminology of successful versus unsuccessful is not ideal. There have been many terms used to describe exit outcomes, positive, negative, planned, unplanned, successful, unsuccessful. I don't think any of these really perfectly captured the outcome that we were interested in, which was whether someone left PSH because they no longer needed the services piece. It's not clear all the time in HMIS why someone left PSH. Like Jared said, I think there's a lot to be desired about HMIS data. So we were doing the best that we can. The other piece is that, for example, an exit to an institutional setting could be considered a positive or successful destination if that's the level of care the person needs or wants, right? So this is not an ideal term, it's an imperfect term, but we worked closely with our study advisory board to determine what's the closest to what we were really trying to capture here, and this was what we decided on. But I would welcome any suggestions that you all may have for alternative terms that we could use in this work going forward. So, and just to go back, again, 7 to 9% of the people exited to these unsuccessful destinations, so homeless indicative service institutional settings, but 12% were leaving PSH for these settings that were lower level of care or need. The other major finding from the study is that of the folks who exited to this lower level of care, the non-homeless service destinations, only about 1 in 10 were observed using homeless services in the 24 months after that exit. Obviously, this is not zero, which is what we would want to see, but this rate is broadly comparable to commonly reported PSH non-retention rates, so that's often around 10 to 20% annually. Obviously not directly equivalent, but these figures do suggest that exit to a lower level of care doesn't appear to dramatically increase risk of returning to homelessness. And you can see the finding was, again, similar in both New Jersey and Pennsylvania. We also looked at health service use patterns and found that those who exited PSH to these successful destinations had generally favorable health service use after. So primary care use in the period after exit was not measurably different from use while in PSH. That likelihood of inpatient hospitalization, both all cause and for mental illness, was greater in the period before PSH than the period after exit. There was a slight decline in use of outpatient behavioral health services after exit, about 1.6 fewer visits per year compared to use while in PSH. But this finding was statistically significant only in Pennsylvania, not New Jersey, and it was a relatively small difference. So again, the main takeaway here is that in a large, very large population level sample across those two states, many people are moving on from PSH services and doing so without major adverse consequences, at least in terms of housing and healthcare utilization outcomes. It also raises this question of who among those who exit PSH are most likely to move on successfully, and what are the factors that predict these successful exits. So we ran some models on this as well and found that compared to those who exited to unsuccessful destinations and those who did not exit, those who exited PSH to successful destinations were more likely to be younger, female, Black, non-Hispanic, or Hispanic Latine, have a substance use disorder, reside in a PSH program with low rates of participant turnover, and that's the program's total number of exits divided by its total number of admissions, and reside in a program in an area with a more affordable rental market. So both tenant-based scattered site and single site programs had more exits to successful destinations than to unsuccessful destinations than these clustered multi-site programs, which are also site-based. And those programs saw a more even split between successful and unsuccessful exits. People exiting those clustered programs were also somewhat more likely to return to homelessness within 24 months of exit. The other program-specific finding was that programs that didn't receive HUD funding saw more tenants exit to unsuccessful destinations, and people exiting from these programs were also somewhat more likely to return to homelessness within 24 months. So conclusions from these findings, given that those who exited to a lower level of care didn't frequently return to homelessness after exit, and their patterns of healthcare use were not substantially worse when compared to use in PSH, we can conclude that homeless service systems can responsibly promote voluntary exits from PSH to a lower level of care to establish whether these positive housing and healthcare exit outcomes hold. We do need to look over a longer period of time beyond 2-3 years. But these initial findings are encouraging. So homeless service systems should continue to explore strategies that support successful exits from PSH, including these moving on initiatives where you pair vouchers with these transition support services to help people kind of make a slower transition out with the affordable housing piece. HUD should put additional resources towards these efforts. To appropriately target the supports and resources, individual program and community level factors should be considered. We found that those individual factors, like not having an SUD, was associated with successful exit. So perhaps that means people with SUD need more assistance to realize that goal of successful exit. The PSH program turnover piece could indicate that providers working in these programs with more established and presumably more stable tenants have more available time to prepare and support individuals who are interested in exiting. So provider caseload should be a consideration if systems want to promote successful exits. With those smaller caseloads, providers could spend more time with people, helping them prepare to exit. To our knowledge, this is the first study to identify affordability as an exit predictor. To promote those exits, then people leaving PSH in places where there's less affordable housing are probably going to need more resources and support. So this could include enhanced subsidies tied to moving on initiatives in high cost areas, housing navigation, other HUD-funded provider support to help folks locate affordable units in places where those resources are scarce. Some important points to note as we reflect on these findings. So people exiting PSH in this study were exiting voluntarily. So we lumped the non-voluntary exits in with that unsuccessful group. So we should really be cautious about extrapolating these findings to tenants who are pushed out or expected to move on within some arbitrary transitional timeline, as may be the case under new federal guidance. If we look at healthcare and housing outcomes for people who are pushed out, their exit outcomes are probably not going to be as positive. The sample only included Medicaid enrolled PSH tenants, so those exit outcomes could look different in the whole of the PSH population without that protective factor of insurance coverage. The study only used 2 states worth of data, so findings could be different in other states. So keep all that in mind. And then I just want to briefly share some takeaways from the other phase of the study that I did on assessing readiness to exit PSH. So we've established that people can and do move on from services, but how do we know when they can move on successfully? And again, this is the other report, again, that's up on the Alliance website. So I conducted a scoping review of all the publicly available tools that assess readiness to move on from PSH and found that there were about a total of 28 relevant sources that I was able to locate through this review. Most of those sources were kind of Likert type scoring tools, like, so, 5 points or something. How does this person rank? I'll show you an example of that in a second. So most were intended to be completed by the provider in collaboration with the tenant, but generally driven by the provider. The primary domains of assessment fell into 5 buckets: housing stability, income and benefits, connection to community and social supports, dependence on services, and health service use. So the most common approach to assessing readiness to move on currently looks something like this. This is a readiness assessment tool similar to the Connecticut Supportive Housing Assessment and Acuity Index that some of you may be familiar with. Most assessments in use today look something like this, and this is just one section of it. Essentially, the tenant's rated across a bunch of domains on a scale of some sort. Then the tenant gets a total score that determines whether moving on is recommended or not recommended. One example of this type of tool is from the Texas Balance of State. It's a tool that has 5 domains, 27 subdomains. It's many pages long. The Texas assessment is completed by staff. The person is rated on a 3 to 9 point scale. Some of the domains are weighted, others are unweighted. You get a total score indicating readiness. So it's a very extensive assessment, not super user-friendly for kind of a brief snapshot of how someone's doing. These assessments are usually administered by the provider, like I said. Sometimes it's completed in consultation with the tenant, but it's primarily a provider-driven process. You can see on this example, even the language of the assessment is in the third rather than the first person. So tenant has not paid rent rather than I have not paid rent. So it's oriented to the third party completion rather than to the tenant themselves for completion. So to better understand, the people who are living in PSH and their perspective on this process, I convened a couple of focus groups with current and former PSH tenants for this study. And what they communicated to me, and this is a quote from one of the participants, is that they know best whether they are ready to move on from services or not, which I think we should hear out now, especially in this moment. So as this person said, tenants are the best judges of whether they are capable of doing this or not, right? They also emphasize the importance of giving people who can move on the opportunity to do so. As this person said, what is the point of forcing people to stay in housing that provides support that they don't need and that they don't use, preventing people who need that support from being able to get into that space? So they have to stay in shelters for years while people who don't need support are still in. And he goes on to say, and while the providers are spending lots and lots of government money to force these people to keep them like prisoners where they don't want to be. So, I mean, financially, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense in any respect, I think. And so my question to them was, what do you think the standard for readiness should be? And how should programs be making these decisions if there's like a finite amount of resources like vouchers to help people move on to the affordable housing without the services? So we talked through, what are the most crucial domains of assessment from their perspective, how they wanted to be assessed for readiness, and considering the findings of the predictor study that I presented previously and other studies of factors associated with successful exit. And from this discussion, I created this tool, an action plan, the LASH, Life After Supportive Housing Readiness Self-Assessment Tool and Action Plan. It's a much more pared down, so easier to use, simple self-assessment that tenants complete themselves. It can be in conversation with the case manager if desired. and they can keep track of where they're at, develop their own plan to improve their readiness score. They score themselves in just 6 domains on a very simple 3-point scale. Usually when they're participating in their regular service plan was what was discussed, just to make it easy. And they have the option to add other domains that they want to work on before moving on. So it's not just a set focus area, set of domains that are predetermined. And then there's a total score at the bottom. They can see how they rate across all domains in that readiness area. Then they come up with their personal action plan that can be with the help of staff, again, to build to the point where they can independently pay rent and utilities, have enough stable income to support themselves, avoid conflicts with law enforcement, landlords, and stay connected with the community services and supports that they need. So what we learned from this review of the existing readiness assessment tools and tenant perspectives on this process is that, to the greatest extent possible, standardized assessments at the individual level, like LASH, should honor tenant voice, autonomy, and choice in the process of assessing readiness to move on. But readiness to move on is not just an individual attribute or responsibility. It really is the result of interactions among various individual, programmatic, and structural factors identified through studies of this, such as the predictor study that I presented earlier. So to promote successful exits from PSH systems, programs and systems also have to be ready for people to move on, right? We need to set people up for success by providing the essential resources and supports that people need in order to exit these programs. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, everyone. Again, please, if you have questions, enter them into the Q&A section of the site. I wanted to I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions. Both of you mentioned housing type, specifically like scattered site or project-based, place-based. I wonder if we could discuss that a little bit more, and if you see some ties between your two studies about what we can conclude about those types of housing and the impacts that they have on outcomes. But even stepping a little bit further back from there, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. And if you could just like provide a brief definition of what is meant by those terms. It's a question for both of you. So if you could jump in.
I may do you want to
Or
start?
all of you, I'm
Or
sorry, all
no?
three of you.
Yeah.
I can start. So, in our HMIS data in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, there's 3 categories. There's tenant-based scatter site, and then there's 2 site-based categories. One was single site-based, and one was clustered or multi-site site-based. And if you look across all those 3 types, so I know normally sometimes we talk about scatter site versus single site, but really those 3 categories kind of complicated a little bit, and there was kind of mixed. It was not as totally clear of tenant based had better outcomes than site based. The site based had both positive and negative outcomes. So our scatter site programs had the tenant based had fewer unsuccessful exits to homelessness. So people leaving to homelessness or institutional settings, or how we defined unsuccessful exits. Scatter site, the tenant based scatter site had fewer of those type exits and more successful exits. But single site programs had fewer returns to homelessness. So after the exit period, when the person went into homelessness, in the 2-year period after exit, people were returning to homelessness more frequently from scatter site and cluster sites. So it's a little bit, you can say maybe people had fewer, and there were fewer people in total exiting for successful or unsuccessful from tenant-based scatter site. So my thinking is that people might prefer to stay in tenant-based scatter site. That's why you see fewer people exiting across the board. but these single site programs having fewer returns to homelessness over the 2 year period makes me wonder if people are being better prepared in single site to exit and live on their own. But again, it's not a 100% clear this type of housing was better than this across the board. So
Yeah,
it's
I just want to echo a lot of similar findings that we had. So we use HMIS data, so we have a similar coding system to thinking about tenant-based, scattered site, project-based sites for PSH. And to our surprise, there weren't large average differences across those two housing types in terms of returns to homelessness. That on average, we saw pretty similar results. What we thought was interesting is that there was still a considerable distribution in terms of how successful programs were in reducing returns to homelessness across both types. So there was a lot of program-based variation within the types, but it wasn't like on average both types were wildly different. And the other thing to clarify is that, what we did see where there was a wrinkle was that for Black older adults, they among the scattered site distribution, they seem to be the ones accessing better quality programs, but we didn't really see that pattern in the project-based or site-based programs. We didn't see as much racial variation there. So I didn't get the sense that there was a clear-cut answer to whether project-based or scattered site was superior overall. It seems to be more nuanced than that, with program quality mattering a lot. And I think the other piece, just to bring in, is the qualitative results, which indicated, I think this kind of reinforces Emmy's point, there was some indication that these site-based programs were able to provide a more robust set of services. And maybe because of the provider who was providing them, but that we heard more about kind of the more extensive sets of supports available in that site-based setting versus the scattered site option that we heard more about from some interview respondents.
So we did have someone who flagged the emerging conversation around supportive housing. It has entered the world of politics in a new way this year, where I guess the model is being questioned by some political actors. Does your research speak to anything about the value of supportive housing, things that should be considered for, I guess, any uh, persons in the body politic who might be considering taking away that particular model or reducing funding for it?
I'll just share a couple things. So our research, while we didn't present it today, also looked at rapid rehousing. And I think some of the political rhetoric around PSH is people think about like housing only versus permanent supportive housing, and so that they feel like people aren't getting the services that they need. Our research does not make any advance on kind of that political debate, but what we do find is that rapid rehousing is incredibly effective as well at reducing returns to homelessness, as measured by needing services in the future from the COC. And so I think I would really highlight that piece. So not only does PSH reduce those returns to needing COC services, but also rapid rehousing does.
Yeah,
and I would just
oh,
sorry, go ahead.
Sammy, you go ahead.
No, I'll let you piggyback on.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to reinforce that that my main takeaway stepping back is that, as Gary mentioned, rapid rehousing seems very effective, but supportive housing just across all analyses seem to be an extremely effective intervention across age groups, across racial groups, and even in for groups that may be the hardest to serve or that have been historically the most vulnerable, saw the biggest benefits to those groups. So I think from that both impact and equity perspective, it's hard to achieve those types of results via other interventions. And so I think PSH really stands out from that perspective. That said, we found that only about 2% of individual records in our HMIS data were linked to PSH. So it's still a rarely accessed intervention. And I think we need to, of course, expand that percentage.
And I would just say for my work, I think my work is showing that PSH works, right? So like there's a misconception, I think, that this work is making a case that PSH isn't needed, that people can just leave these services because they don't need it. But really what it's showing is that after some period of time, by building up self-sufficiency, which is this administration is very concerned about, or by, overcoming the barriers that to housing stability that you experience before entering PSH, whether you're aging out of substance use or, you're stabilizing psychiatrically or whatever is happening, PSH having the services available to you and having the stable housing that you get through PSH is why people are able to move on successfully and not re-enter homeless services. So without that very important service, if we're just pulling the rug out from under people who are already in PSH or not providing sufficient PSH for those who do need it, you're missing the opportunity to keep people out of the homeless service system with the long-term supports that people are seeking and need.
And then, Gary and Jared, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the factors that you were able to examine as a part of your study. There's a couple questions here where I think people want clarification on, like, were you able to look at things like social ties or incarceration connections? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, let me just clarify one thing with the question. Is it thinking about the how we measured like quality of a PSH program? Is that kind of where this question is coming from? Or is it about outcomes, right? Like, did we look at other outcomes beyond returns to services?
Well, I think it's like people trying to understand you might want to get into what you just spoke to, but trying to
Yeah.
understand the explanations for the outcomes. Like, is
Oh,
there
I see.
anything else that you can tell us?
I
Because I
see.
think there are
Yeah.
things that people immediately think about why people might be successful
Right.
in PSH or not, social
Yeah.
connections, et cetera. Were you able to delve into some of those issues?
Yeah, I think unfortunately with HMIS data, we don't have full visibility into all those important dynamics that can explain why some folks are able to really thrive in a PSH setting and others may return to homelessness. So it was hard for us to get a lot of clarity on some of those fine-grained patterns. I mean, from the qualitative interviews, it definitely seemed like social connection was important and part of why some folks were able to stay in their environment and others felt like they had to leave. There was also a racial pattern of white older adults feeling more compelled or more confident about leaving, right? They just felt that they may be able to leave and be successful on their own, to a greater extent than Black older adults. And that could also partially explain our findings, right? You would see a higher risk of returning to homelessness if you were confident that you could leave, and then it ended up not working out that way. But in terms of having clear evidence about some of those other factors that could explain racial differences, it unfortunately with HMIS and administrative data, it was hard to really pin them down.
And I will say that for ours, we, you know, brought the study findings to our advisory board because we also were curious about this and we're like, what, what do you think is explaining this? And our HMIS also is could be better, and we don't aren't able to flesh it out just using those data alone. So, and their theories were that maybe these groups have greater access to social connections, and that's why they're able to leave to permanent housing destinations from PSH. So, younger folks might have more social connections that are living, females, minority groups versus white might have more family connections. That was the theory of the advisory board. We have no way to test that, but that was their hunch.
And there's Emmy, another question for you about the lash and next steps with that. Maybe you could talk about what happens next, and will you, I guess, be studying long-term outcomes of people who have participated or used the have been administered the lash,
Yeah, so
Or is there any
I
other steps?
Yeah, I'm getting a lot of questions from people, and I will make this public. You can access it through the Alliance. You're welcome to use it in your programs from that report that's on the Alliance's website. And please get in touch with me if you have questions about it or want to talk about it further. Obviously we need funding to pilot test it and do it rigorously. So I'll be looking for additional research funding to try to test that out. But I think the next steps will be to refine it in consultation with providers and with people who are living in PSH to see how it fits within the work and get kind of further refinement of that tool that way. And yeah, and see how it works for folks. So happy to discuss.
Okay. And I think this was a question for Jared and Gary, but Amy may also have insights. Is retirement age and decreased income associated with that a predictor of the PSH outcomes?
We looked at some of these fine-grained differences, among individuals who are just before they turned age 65 and just after, and we just didn't see the kind of shifts in outcomes that we expected to see, right, in either direction. So there was not much variation across those narrow age bands. The difference had more to do with just general retirement age adults versus those who were older adults, 55 to 64. And Gary, feel free to chime in if you have anything to add.
Well, I just wanted to highlight that last point that you made, that if you just look at the raw population differences, that there are much lower incidence of returns to homelessness or needing COC services after the age of 65 than there is before the age of 65. And so it is the case that generally the availability of more supports to people who are over 65 are supportive and help them maintain their housing stability. So that's important. What we didn't find was any specific differential patterns as it related to receiving PSH and kind of comparing across the Black and the white population.
Okay.
And we did find age related to successful exit, but it was the younger valence, right? So you're more likely to exit successfully if you're younger than if you're older.
And I'll do maybe one last question, I guess, depending on how much you want to talk. Is moving on from PSH, how let me go back directly to the person's words. Was length of tenancy examined, and how did that factor into successful versus unsuccessful exits from PSH?
So people with a longer length of stay in PSH were more likely to exit successfully, as you might assume. I think we were unable to do really fine grain analysis on that, right, and figure out, um, how long is what's contributing to that, or any other elements of, the type of PSH and length of stay and types of PSH or anything like that. But yes, which I think is probably what you would think, right? Is that if you have more support over time, or if you're have a longer time kind of aging in place and able to uh, figure out how to manage your housing stability in housing, that you would do better. So
Yeah, I think we can say from some descriptive analyses we can make a similar point, which is that the Black retirement age adults seem to be in their PSH placement for a longer period of time than otherwise similar white retirement age adults. And that also corresponded to the more favorable outcomes that we saw on average for the Black retirement age adults. So some indirect evidence that that duration may be helping to promote, or an indication that there's going to be a better outcome down the line.
Well, I would like to thank all of our speakers today. It has been a pleasure hearing about your work today, but also just working with you over the length of the projects. And by working with you, I mean learning from your insights and hearing about the development of the projects. It's been quite an effort over the last couple of years. I would like to thank everyone else who is here attending today. we certainly, the Alliance appreciates all of you and your interactions with our work and these offerings that we put together for you. If you have further thoughts about things that you would like to see from the Alliance, please do share them at info at endhomelessness.org, I think it is, or info at naeh.org. Once again, I would also remind you, as we discussed at the top of the hour, this is going to be a part of a series that we will be releasing in the next couple months. There'll be a series of research studies that will be on our website, and that we will also be featuring in future webinars. So we do encourage you to continue to follow this work and continue to engage. And so with that, I'm going to say, it should be afternoon for everyone. Have a good afternoon
Mhm.
and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Joy.